Welcome to the Real Faith Podcast with me, your host, Chris Goins, a podcast featuring real talk with real people about God, theology, and life. Our goal, authentic, vulnerable, and raw conversations on a variety of topics with a view towards looking at what God's Word has to say. These conversations will help you apply your faith in God's Word to the real challenges of life. With that, let's jump into today's episode. Thanks so much for joining us for the Real Faith Podcast. This is episode number 6. I'm so glad that you're along for this ride. Hey, make sure you subscribe right now before you forget about it so you never miss an episode. Also, rate and review on whatever format you listen to. It really helps us get the word out because our desire is to add value to people. By the way, we've already surpassed 1,000 downloads. When we hit 10,000, we're going to have a party, so stay tuned. Let me tee this episode up with a series of questions. Are you struggling with anxiety, fear, worry, or maybe just this nagging feeling of uncertainty? Do you feel like you're caught in the middle of a whirlwind of questions? Questions like, how has this happened? How did I get here? Will this ever end? Maybe you're plagued with all kinds of what ifs, and those what ifs are starting to overwhelm you. My guest on today's episode would probably tell you that those questions are normal, understandable, even healthy at a time like this. Today, we're talking with Dr. Diana Paulk about maintaining equilibrium, about emotional and mental health in a COVID world. This conversation is so rich. Dr. Paulk is a wealth of knowledge, and she unpacks so much in this episode. We talk about trauma, how it can manifest, some strategies for dealing with trauma. We talk about depression and steps a person can take to climb out of depression. Hey, don't miss the last 10 minutes of the podcast where I walk out some of my own journey with depression. Dr. Paulk also shares a triad that will help you identify whether or not you might need to seek professional help. With that said, here's my interview with Dr. Diana Paulk. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Diana Paulk to the show, and we're going to talk today about emotional and mental health in a COVID-19 world. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Paulk. She is a licensed psychologist who has more than 20 years of experience. She is certified as an advanced trauma therapy specialist, working with individuals and helping them to overcome issues associated with past and present trauma. That includes things like stress, avoidance, overwhelming feelings of anxiety, depression, and worry. She has her PhD in counseling psychology and is the owner and director of the Birmingham Anxiety and Trauma Therapy Center. When she's not doing all of that, and that was quite a mouthful, she is also a full-time mom to her beautiful adopted daughter, Lily, whom she adopted from China in 2008. Mm-hmm. Dr. Paulk, we're so honored to welcome you to the Real Faith Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for being here. Dr. Paulk, I interviewed you for a YouTube video back in mid-March when the COVID crisis was just beginning. It's 4 months later. We're still in the crisis, and it appears that there's not an end in at least close sight to this crisis. So a question that comes immediately to my mind, your expertise is trauma, past and present.
Yes.
What qualifies as trauma?
Well, the shortest answer is anything that sparks your amygdala into working and moves you into some form of that fight, flight, freeze, or submit, right? And for a very, very long time, psychologists defined trauma in terms of what happened to somebody instead of how somebody responded to something.
Wow.
Right? And so that is slowly changing. I consider myself a part of, like, I call it a rogue group of mental health professionals who say, no. It's not about what happened. It's about how somebody responded to it. So you can have a history of trauma without having ever had a gun put to your head.
Wow.
Or been in a horrific car accident. These things that we naturally associate with trauma.
So in some sense, trauma is very subjective to the individual, how they process whatever's taking place or has taken place in their life.
Sure.
Do these events that we're currently facing, and I'm thinking of COVID-19, the health crisis, the economic uncertainty associated with that, the current social and racial tension in our world, we could go on and on with all that this year has brought. Does it qualify as trauma?
Big time. And I'll tell you why. So the way I've been explaining it this week, right, is that there are several gray clouds floating above all of us at any one time. And, you listed 5 things. So think about having 5 clouds.
Wow.
And to each individual, which of those clouds is pressing on them on any given day may be different, right? So, but what's happening that we would begin to describe as complex trauma, which is layer on layer on layer on layer of lots of things that wouldn't necessarily be considered in and of itself a traumatic incident, begin to happen. So we have multiple decisions. It seems like every other day, right, that we're being asked to make. And we're being asked to make that in the absence of clear direction and facts, right? We can't see COVID like smallpox. We could see smallpox on somebody's body or their face, right? And so it's like this mysterious thing that's floating around, but it's not just that. It is, we have a huge election coming up in November. And, Black Lives Matter and the racial unrest, for those of us who have very close friends who are Black, it's an opportunity to learn more. But you're talking about change, right? And that can be very stressful to try to struggle with those kinds of things. And then even, some of the prayer requests sent in to A2 have been, okay, so I signed my kid up for online, but I'm not sure that was the right thing to do.
Right.
And so it's just a little bit after a little bit after a little bit, and it adds up.
Well, what's some of the toll? It seems like that this crisis, along with all that you just mentioned, compounding crisis, it's taking or having a mental, emotional toll on us. What are some of the ways that gets demonstrated?
Well, let me first say it's demonstrated in people not the same across the board.
Okay.
So there are multiple ways. And, the first thing is we tend to fall back on previous, psychologists would call it regressing, right? Or Freud would, So we're experiencing this regression. So we fall back on something that used to help us a little, that we've actually grown past, but under pressure, we fall back on that. Everybody's talking about COVID-19, the 19 pounds everybody's gaining, right? Because why? One of the earliest ways that you were comforted as a child, and it goes all the way back to infancy, is somebody stuck a bottle in your mouth.
That's amazing.
Right? And so, like, if I say, okay, so we just watched a sitcom and the girl was dumped by her boyfriend and she walks into the kitchen and she opens the freezer and she pulls out
ice cream.
How do you know that? How do you know? We have these stereotypes because there's an element of truth in them and experience in them. So that's one way where we kind of fall back on, I was doing so well, but forget it. I did that. I was doing the keto diet, and then I was like, oh, I'm so tired. There's so much going on. Maybe I'll just have regular ice cream instead of keto. Now I'm back on keto, but until and through my vacation, I was like living it up. If there was chocolate, not keto chocolate, but regular, right?
Yes.
That's what I was going for.
Yes.
And so it's something natural that we do. Now, we may have increased fears. certainly increased worries. We're seeing a lot of that. A lot of people are also coming into therapy, and they are exhibiting all the signs of depression because we're in a position where we could fall into something that we would call learned helplessness, right?
Wow.
So it doesn't matter what I do, I can't win.
Wow.
You know, do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? And I'm getting different messages from all over the country. So what do I do? How do I make a decision? And it's very difficult.
Wow. What are some of the ways, and I'm certain this will be as unique as the individual as well. And thank you for pointing that out, that not all of us are responding in a similar manner. One of the things, by the way, before I ask the follow-up question, one of the things that I seem to sense, and perhaps it's just the people I associate with, is a growing sense of frustration that even tends to express itself in anger.
Yes.
Is that growing? Are you seeing an increase of that?
Are you reading Facebook? Are you reading the news? Are you? It's just escalating, and that's actually really common under pressure. That emotions begin to escalate, right? And they get higher and higher and higher. And then if they're fed by other people who happen to be kind of thinking the same thing, right? And so then you've got that kind of group influence that comes in as well.
Wow. So this may need to be two questions instead of one question. How do we de-escalate that frustration and anger?
Okay.
And what are some processes or strategies that will allow us to heal from or cope with, whatever the correct word is, the trauma that we're currently experiencing right now? Again, it may be two questions.
Okay. And interrupt me. Feel free to do that. So the first thing is we need to be aware of when we are escalating. And as much as we have self-help books and, psychology all over the place, humans don't really naturally check in with themselves. They don't naturally take their own temperature, if you will.
Wow.
Like, how am I doing today? What's going on with me today? Unless we remind ourselves to do that. Like, how am I doing? And I mean, if we all as a nation just began to do that today, I think a lot of things would change in less than a week. Because we're walking around not realizing, we talked last time about leaking, and we don't realize we're leaking all over the place via frustration and anger. And that, anger has a target.
Wow.
Right? And so it's toward other people as well. So becoming aware of, oh my gosh, I am escalating, because, again, it's easier on a scale of 10 being totally escalated and I'm out of control and I'm doing this or that. And I'm going to be sorry about it tomorrow, it's easier to bring a 1 down to a 0 than a 9 down to a 0.
I bet.
Which sounds really simple, but it's very important if you can grasp that.
Right. Are there some techniques for self-assessment or self-awareness that will help us grow in that? Because I think self-awareness is something that often all of us lack in. I know I struggle with it until sometimes it's my spouse or one of my kids that they make me aware, and it's like, oh, wow. So are there techniques or strategies we can use to become more self-aware?
I think so. And I think you actually mentioned a big part of it, but you have to give them permission first, right?
Those who are close to you.
Yeah, your friends and your family to say, it's okay if you tell me if I'm kind of headed toward the ledge, right? Or I'm headed off the deep end. But that has to be, you have to give them permission for that. It's helpful if it's kind of formalized a little bit, because otherwise we may become very defensive, right? And then we're escalating even more because we're defending ourselves about our, I am not angry.
You're describing me.
So So that is a huge one. But again, if your spouse can say, remember when you said that I could let you know that you're leaking a little bit? Well, you're leaking. It's much easier for you to receive and much easier for them to tell you about it, right? So self-awareness, and this is not to be too cliche, right? It's taking a moment and it could be 3 seconds. 3 seconds is pretty long if you're checking in with yourself, right? If you're going to try to do it multiple times a day. But it's to listen, kind of check in, maybe do a little bit of a comparison and contrast, not in a negative way, but to say, okay, how am I doing today? What's happening? Am I moving forward? Am I moving backward? Or am I kind of stuck in neutral? And neutral's backward, by the way, And so taking a moment, right? The other thing is that self-awareness and that will help you begin to go, oh, wait, I'm escalating because I did a check-in about an hour and a half ago and I'm not in the same place, right? And then you want to try to intervene. And that, again, there's multiple ways to do that. We talked about box breathing last time.
I remember that.
What I do, and I do this for myself and I do it for my patients as well, is we take that 10-point scale and we take each point and say, okay, if I'm a 1, what am I going to do? How am I going to address this? And I did this because that's what I do at a 1. If I notice I'm starting to escalate a little bit at a 1, and it's a smidge, right? But I recognize it, and I will literally kind of, for some reason, my anxiety and stuff, it resides over here, and I will go, I am not having that today, right? It's kind of like Caesar Milan when he goes psst to the dogs.
Yes.
It's literally doing that to yourself, kind of like, he goes under the neck,
Yes.
but you do that kind of thing,
Wow.
right? At 1, and then what are you going to do at 2?
Yes.
What are you going to do at 3, 4, 5, 6? Now, if you're starting to work at 1, you're not really going to get to a 6 anywhere near as often as when you've not tried to be self-aware and all of a sudden you're faced with the fact that you're a 7.
Wow. That's very powerful. If we're aware at a 1
right,
or 2,
right,
it's going to be easier to de-escalate than if we
right,
allow ourselves to get to 5, 6, 7 on
right,
up. I think that's very insightful for people.
Okay. Now, I want to put a little caveat out there. Okay. And maybe we can run through something that I call anatomy of a feeling.
Cool.
Okay. So, God created feelings. They've got to be there for a good reason.
Right.
And not just to reject, right? And not just to say, oh, well, this is very uncomfortable for me, and so I'm not going to experience this, right? It's to say, because the type of de-escalation and the type of, let's see if we can bring this down, lessen our anger, our frustration, our depression, is because it doesn't match reality. It's unwarranted. We can talk about that in the time of COVID if you want to. But that's why we don't like anxiety, because our head is saying, okay, wait, that is just a little teeny tiny worm. I don't need to be afraid of that. And yet our emotions are out of sync with the size of the issue, right? Yes. So how do you figure out what that is? That's anatomy of a feeling. So realizing that sometimes anxiety is a gift, right? So it's 2:00 in the morning. You hear what sounds like a glass breaking downstairs. All of a sudden you go into fight, flight, freeze, submit. You're trying to figure out what to do. This is not the time to do deep breathing, right? At all. This is the time to get your baseball bat and head downstairs and get ready to whack somebody if there's an intruder, and then just thank God if there's a cat, or whatever, right?
Right.
So how do we figure that out? And you can learn to do this very quickly with anatomy of a feeling. First is the universe trying to tell me something? That's the universe with a capital U, right? So is the universe trying to tell me something? So let's say I'm really frustrated and I check in with, is the universe trying to tell me something? And I'm going to be thinking about this. And I'm very frustrated because my Black friend is afraid to stop if she has to drive through the state of Mississippi for fear. And that's frustrating to me. Should I just ignore that? Or maybe I need to do something about it, right? But then there are examples where I should ignore it. So how do we figure that out? So is the universe trying to tell me something? The answer is either going to be yes, no, or maybe. Okay? If the answer is yes, you must address. Okay? So, oh no, it's 2:00. I'm scared to death. Should I address this? Is the universe trying to tell me something? Yes. Go check for an intruder, right? So address it. Get the baseball bat, go down there and get ready to take care of somebody, right? So if the answer is yes, you must address. If the answer is no, let it go. Okay? That's a tough one.
This is so good.
If the answer is no, let it go.
Yes.
So it's 2:00 in the morning. And I've awakened, and is the universe trying to tell me something? I heard something break, but then I heard, meow.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no, I don't have to get out of bed. I can roll over. Let it go.
Yeah.
Right? The other one is maybe, right? So if the answer is maybe, you've got to do more research and circle back up to the original question. So when you're doing that research, you're looking at statistical probabilities, right? So I'm scared to death that something bad is going to happen to my family. I'm afraid that they're going to fall off a bridge in Italy while tight roping, tight walking. Well, we're not in Italy. We're not, so what's the statistical probability that that's going to happen? Slim to none.
Right.
Right. So we've got to ask ourselves, but there are things that are much closer to that. I don't want my children to come down with COVID. Right. So what's the statistical probability that that's going to happen? Okay. Well, then we get in a plethora of conundrums, right? Because of all the different things pieces of information we're being bombarded with. But you do your research and then you decide how to proceed.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So that can be very helpful when you realize, okay, I'm escalating, but I need to check this to make sure that this isn't something that the universe is trying to tell me, using it as a message.
Wow.
You know.
So what I've heard you say, I believe, Dr. Paulk, is when we feel this escalation, reflection is a gift.
Yes.
So take some time to reflect.
Take a second. It doesn't even take long.
Right. That question, what is the universe trying to tell me, that needs to become part of the way we speak to ourselves.
Yeah.
Come to agreements with those closest to us.
Yeah.
So that they have permission to help us recognize escalation in ourselves. But you emphasize we need to have an agreement so that we don't fall into defensiveness.
Well, it's just preventative.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Oh, I've seen that myself. So let's go back then to that original question. With all of this trauma that we're experiencing, what are some ways that we can begin to process, heal from, or cope with all of the compounding trauma?
So we've got to look at all the tools in our chest, or as I say, like to patients, I say, right now you are really good at redirecting, right? So when you're upset about something, you're great at running outside and starting a project or something like that. But again, we need more than one arrow, right? Because there will be situations where you can't use redirection.
So that's one strategy, redirect.
One strategy.
Okay.
The other one is to physically engage. We've actually talked about some of these things in our previous get-together. to engage your body, right? And some people may say, well, that's redirection. And I would kind of double dog dare that because, and I meant to bring the book and I forgot about it, but there's a great book out there I recommend to people called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's written by a guy named Bessel van der Kolk. I actually studied with him. And he does such a good job of explaining how our bodies really are keeping the score on this. And I was talking to somebody actually this morning, saying, and they said, sometimes when I'm struggling with something, it's like I have to move my hand. And I'm like, that makes so much sense to me because it's your body that's keeping the score.
Wow.
And it may be your body that can help you get another point. Right.
You recommend that book to people?
Yes.
The Body Keeps the Score by whom again?
Bessel, Bessel, van der Kolk, VanDerKolk, Amazon. You can have it. Well, we don't know if you'll have it tomorrow, but you'll have it soon.
I've heard the book referenced a few times, so I'm going to take action and get that.
It's really good. I haven't, now it can be, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming when you start reading and you see yourself in what you're reading. And I just tell people, well, then close the book and you can open it later, right? But most of the time people open the book and go, oh my gosh, this is me, this is me, this is me, this is me.
Wow.
Another thing that happens, and it's good to be aware of and then challenge ourselves on this, is that when you're in the middle of a trauma, remember the amygdala is turning a lot of parts of your brain off, okay? And so one thing that you tend to lose is your imagination and your creativity. And a lot of times, especially in the United States, we think about imagination and creativity as, crafts. Okay, this is just some fun little hobby thing that you're doing. But if you go all the way back to childhood and ask any preschool teacher, that teacher is going to tell you that play is children's work, right? And why is that so? Well, they are repeatedly, over and over again, using their imagination to try out things, and they're learning as they go, right? And we still need that as adults. I'm a very visual person, and, I tell my patients as I'm talking to them, I've got like a movie literally just running in the back of my head.
Wow.
And if I'm going to go do something, I'm imagining it and I'm running scenarios and things like that.
Wow.
That's imagination.
Wow.
That's creativity, and it helps us perform. It helps us get things done.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're going to remember one thing from this podcast, this is what I would love for us all to remember, and that is 2 words: slow down. In our culture in the United States, we like to push through. We honor people who get things done no matter the expense, right? And I see a lot of people who are just trying to push through, and it's not ending up in a positive or being fruitful for them because they didn't honor the situation and slow down. I mean, we've got multiple things that we're dealing with in a way that we don't know what to expect, right? And yet we're not slowing down. We're trying, and in some instances, we're trying to speed up.
Wow.
And we've got to slow down. We'll be able to think more clearly because that's another symptom of trauma. We're foggy. We can't put things together because that part of our brain's been turned off by our amygdala.
Right. Dr. Paulk, going back just a piece, first of all, thank you for the challenge to slow down. It's something that I have to remind myself of regularly. But I want to go back to that really interesting thought that you raise with imagination and creativity. How do we turn that into an action step that we can take to help us process trauma? Because you say it's, I don't know if I've got your exact words here, it's suppressed when trauma hits. We lose that. Are there ways that we can increase that or recover that?
I'm thinking yes. And I think that in this particular global situation that we've got to kind of consciously make some opportunities for ourselves, right? To engage in something that is creative, that will use our imagination and identify things that are going to stop us from doing that. I'll give you an example. My daughter, she is very artistic to the degree that, she's got the easel, she's got the paints, all of that. And yet we have to be careful, or she could just sit in front of the television. It's got a hypnotic effect.
Yes, it
does. A couple of days ago, I said, this week you need to make sure to do some art, right? And so there's a conscious thing to say, okay, so we have the environment and the opportunity for her because she's got the materials and everything that she needs. She's got the time, but we've also identified this very big thing that really keeps a lot of us from activities where we could grow.
Right.
And that's the television or screens. Right. And there is a hypnotic effect, and there is, especially with social media, because the human brain was not meant to try to multitask, if you will. We're supposed to deal with one thing, take a little bit of a break, then deal with another thing. But if you notice in social media, that's not what happens. It's, oh, hey, yeah, this, oh, wait, this,
yes,
oh, this,
yes.
oh, this, oh, this,
yes.
Right? Well, what's happening is when we're not taking those breaks, then our brain is not able to recover from the energy we spent on whatever the first thing was. And then we can actually go into a deficit, And so we wonder why we're foggy. That's contributing to it as well.
Let's talk a little more about that. I wanted to ask, does outside stimuli, like news media, like social media, like television, Netflix, we could go on and on with the various services that provide online streaming endlessly. Does it play a role in whether we maintain our mental and emotional health? If so, what are your recommendations when it comes to navigating all the noise out there through all of these various media channels coming at us?
Okay, lots of thoughts, couple of things. The word is balance. Okay, so should we, shut everything, all screens off, and live like 100 years ago? And no, that would not be wise. If we go back to Anatomy of a Feeling, would not be wise. But we've got to use our critical thinking in terms of what we're allowing ourselves to be exposed to and our sources of information, right? And I was thinking about this morning. Really, what we need to do is go back to the 4th grade when we were taught how to write a book report, and we had to have 5 sources or 10 sources. And the teacher would say, okay, you need to think about the quality of that source for your book report, right? So, we're probably not going to go to a comic book to write our World War II book report.
Right.
We're going to try to make really good decisions and think about it in a critical way, right? I don't think we're doing that a lot with social media. We're just kind of turning on the faucet, and it's just flowing over us.
Yes.
And so I would recommend that people choose and say, okay, I need to have some information, right? But do I need 2 hours of that information? right? And so I tend to like news sources that give me bullets of topics. First of all, they'll just give me, Trump did this, Governor Ivey did this, blah, 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 blah. Schools are opening, that kind of thing. And then if I've already know what I know about whatever topic it is, I'll go, I don't need any more information on that. So keep on going down the line, right? And so it's using, putting the decision back on yourself in terms of what you allow into your mind.
So perhaps you could set some time limits on how long you allow yourself to go on social media or engage with other media sources.
And when you say time limits, I think it means that you're going to have to set a buzzer. Because of that hypnotic effect, you can lose an hour. Like I will say, okay, I'm going to look at this for 10 more minutes, and then 30 minutes is gone. And I have no idea where they went, right? And that's 30 minutes I'll never get back, right?
Yes. One of the questions that I've been asking myself about what I watch, read, view, listen to is it draining me or is it energizing me?
Yes.
Is it increasing my love for God and people, or is it somehow frustrating me? And I think we need to live with conscious tension about that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question for people even like myself and others that I know are in our audience. For someone who has struggled with or may currently be struggling with depression, the continuing safer at home order, the deprivation of actual human interaction. I mean, it can exacerbate those feelings of depression. So what are some ways that a person, if they've started to sense that because they're not having as much human interaction as they had hoped for, what are some ways they can begin to climb out of that depressive state that they find sort of exacerbated just by all that's going on, but particularly the deprivation of human interaction?
It's interesting because one of kind of little terms I've put on this is that it would be really helpful for us to have a pioneering spirit, is what I'm going to call it, right? When you think about the first people from the East who decided that they're going to travel to the West and settle somewhere in the Great Plains. And so they they finally made it and they've gotten some shelter. And then what are they going to do? Right? And that pioneering spirit says, wait, I want to look at all my options. I want to plug into my creativity and my imagination and see what I can do about this. Right? So, I may sound like I'm contradicting myself all over the place. But again, the magic word is balance here.
Yes.
But this is not 1918, right? And technology that we have today can connect us in incredibly meaningful ways. And so, I know of people who say, okay, well, there's a stay-at-home order. And so, we have not left the house for 4 months. That's not what the stay-at-home order means, right? And so do I think you should go to Central Park and meet 50 other people? No, but can you find, there is no one in the parking lot behind the church right now.
Right.
There could be a mom and her 2 kids on bikes in the back, and it would be as healthy as could be, right? So it's using the creativity to think outside the box to say, wait, how much am I actually isolated, and how can I think about this in a way that's going to allow me to have some contact or get outside the house, right? Does that make any sense?
Oh, it made a lot of sense.
Okay.
And I love the fact that a couple of times during our conversation, you mentioned imagination and creativity. And I think we lack that partly because of some of the things you mentioned, social media. We're viewing, watching extraordinary hours of Netflix.
Yeah.
It's amazing, which is a soul And by the way, I don't mean all content there, but some of it's just soul draining.
Right.
Instead of doing some of the things you're thinking about.
Well, and let's go back to that balance. My daughter and her two friends have automatically kind of started their own routine. And at 8:00 every night, they meet, right? And they are building a city in Minecraft. Right? They're building an entire city together.
Yes.
And that is a way to use your creativity and technology, right? And someone called Minecraft social media, and doing that in a healthy way and something that's going to benefit you, right? So we want to have that balance there, and think about how this isn't being a prisoner of war. And I don't mean to make light of prisoners of war, right? But this is not the same thing as that. And we've got to get to reality about that. Yes. Now, if you can't seem to get past that, and I mentioned something called learned helplessness, right, before. And that term came out of a specific research study where they used, this was a long time ago, because they used puppies, right? And they'd put a puppy in a cage, and they would wire half of the cage to be to where if the puppy went over to that side of the cage, it would get an electric shock. And so the puppy very quickly learns how to only stay on this side, stay on the red side, not the blue side or whatever. But then the researchers mix it up. Right? And they start shocking the puppy when it's on the red side. And it tries to run over to the blue side, and it gets very confused. And very quickly, the puppy just stays in a corner and it doesn't do anything. Right? That's learned helplessness. And I think we do see some of that with the stay-at-home and the isolation, where people, they've become stuck on their couch. Not that they're couch potatoes because they're sloven or lazy or anything. They're stuck. They're stuck on their couch, right? And so there does come a time when you need some help, right? And that help might come from family and friends, but the help may be need to be professional as well.
So I wanted to ask about that at some point. What are the key indicators that I'm at a point, whether it's my depression, my anxiety, any other number of emotional or mental issues?
Sure.
What are some indicators that I'm at a point, I'm not going to be able to break out of this with my own ingenuity, creativity, imagination, some of the things you've mentioned.
Yeah.
My friends and family, they aren't able to help me. I need professional help.
Yeah.
Are there some indicators we can look for?
Yeah. So one is that regression we were talking about before. We were talking about babies' bottles and things like that. But when we notice this pattern of I keep just going backward, right? And as much as I try, I can't seem to get to my typical ways of functioning, right? Or I have to... I'm using unhealthy ways in order to be able to kind of keep my head above water. Maybe, I can't get it together without a drink in the morning. Or I just can't get it together at all. Or maybe, and psychologists think of like 3 areas of functioning. They think of family, home, work, and social. Right. So I'm not seeing any of my usual friends. Okay. Or they're giving me feedback like, hey, where were you? We had that Zoom call and you've missed the last 2 weeks. Or they might be very specific and say, girl, you need some therapy. I'm really concerned about you. What's happening? I haven't seen you. I haven't heard from you. You haven't called, right? That's the social area. Work, if you just can't get done what you usually get done, and it seems that you should be able to reasonably get it done even in COVID, right? Because I stand by slowing down, right? I really stand by that. But again, this is atypical, right? And then with your family, you're having relationship issues, and you can't seem to rally, if you will, even for a little bit. Those are all really good signs if your functioning is what we would say has gone down in all three areas, definitely.
So socially, there's a tendency towards isolation. Work, there's a tendency towards fog and the inability to perform those required tasks that usually you perform with ease.
Yeah.
And then family, it may be fraught with friction or some kind of just disconnect there.
Well, I'm going to say there's a continuum, right? So let's take social again. That's one side of the continuum. But the other side might be I'm taking lots of risky behaviors. I'm engaging in risky behaviors.
So it can express itself in a number of ways.
That's
Not
right.
just isolation, but maybe even escalation into behaviors we wouldn't ordinarily do. Promiscuity or any number of things.
Anything. Yeah. Patterns, right? Patterns that we just usually don't see in ourselves, right? Or we can't get to that kind of typical way of functioning where we used to before. Another big thing I want to say with depression, okay, because there's a lot of depression out there right now.
Yes.
A lot of times people think they associate depression with mood changes, and it's not always a negative mood. One thing that a lot of people tend to miss with depression, which is a huge symptom of depression, is something that a psychologist called anhedonia. And all that means is things you used to find pleasure in bring you no pleasure now.
Oh, my.
Right? So, and this is a good way to kind of watch out for friends and family as well.
If you notice that, is that a signal? I probably need some help.
It's a signal to at least begin a conversation with that family member who's displaying that, or if you see it in yourself, to talk to somebody who knows you well, to go, how off am I here? You know, and you can always, I think sometimes people are like, I don't know if I'm sick enough to go to therapy, you know, and if you go to therapy and you say, golly, I think I'm depressed, I think I'm having all these problems, blah, blah, blah. And the therapist is like, they're not going to go, oh, yeah, let's follow that road. If you're not depressed, they're going to go, well, I'm confused here because I don't see that. They're going to let you know, right? So you can't make a mistake with going to therapy.
Yes.
So people shouldn't be afraid of that. I'm not trying to say everybody get in line and go to therapy, but you shouldn't be afraid of it if you're wondering. You don't have to be super sick in order to go.
And I will say, Dr. Paulk, I think everyone can benefit from good, solid therapists. And I've mentioned this before publicly, but I've been to Birmingham Anxiety Trauma and Therapy Center. Personally, my wife and I mentioned this on a previous podcast, we just noticed some tendencies arising in us during COVID where we were not being kind. It wasn't as if we had these huge dysfunctions, but we care about our marriage and we decided, hey, let's get some help. So we began seeing one of your therapists, and it's not as if they shared incredible insight and information. They did, but it wasn't that as much as it was the process and the accountability, knowing that we were going to see her every week, that she was going to say, report on your progress, your assignments. And something about the process, it's actually, it's not just been helpful. It's been life energizing at a personal level and a couple level. So on the screen, hopefully, Chris, we can bring up the website. What is the website for Birmingham Anxiety Trauma
Therapist Birmingham.
Boy, that's easy to remember.
Yep.
Therapistbirmingham.com.
Plural. Therapist, plural, Birmingham.com. And your number there? 205-807-5372.
I really love the work of this center, and it's obvious that they're a blessing to many because in the middle of a crisis, they're actually expanding their office space beginning next week.
That's kind of a two-edged sword, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Paulk, I want to ask you a few other things, but seriously, in all seriousness, thank you for the way you're your organization. And we know that there are other therapists outside BATT that really serve our city, and we are not in any way diminishing them. But I really thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you. Could I tie in what you just said with trauma?
Yes.
Not a trauma diagnosis, but trauma itself. So we know that the change and improvement that people make in therapy, that 68% of that change is related to the relationship and the rapport between the therapist and the patient.
Wow.
Right? And so we have a rule at our place that if you come and you don't like your therapist, please let us know, because we're going to give you another one.
Yes.
Because it's about the fit and the match. And we do switch people around.
Yes.
Right? Even from me. Right? Because sometimes, I might remind you of your Aunt Sally who was verbally abusive to you.
Right.
You need somebody that looks different.
Right.
And so it's that connection that is powerful, right? So it's not necessarily that here's a list of everything you need to do and then, you're healed and go, right? It's that connection that happens. Trauma, right? One of the hallmarks of trauma is disconnect.
Wow.
Right? Disconnect. And so, so that's one of the reasons why we specialize in trauma, right? Because we really have something already set up for people to begin to reconnect and make those connections.
Wow.
Right? So anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask a few other questions,
Sure.
Dr. Paulk. I thank you so much for your time. We talked about this a little, but there are a lot of new listeners to this podcast. One of the things impacted by COVID and the safer stay-at-home order is a sense of ritual and routine. Mm-hmm. Could you talk again? And again,
Sure.
we talked about that some
Sure.
during our YouTube interview about the importance of ritual and routine during this extended, because it looks like it's going to continue through a significant portion of the remainder of the year, if not until next year.
That's right. That's right. And the biggest part of what you said that is challenging is we don't know, right? Because human beings can handle just about anything as long as they expect it, right? So let's think about the difference. Let's think about 2 deaths, okay? Let's think about a 95-year-old woman who's had cancer for 2 years, and she passed away in her sleep last night, right? Okay, that's one death. Now let's think about a 16-year-old who was in a car accident last night, right? Those are going to be 2 very different funerals.
Yes.
Why? We don't expect that 16-year-old to die. We have expectations that 16-year-old is going to be 95, right? And so when these things happen that are unexpected, right, that blows us out of the water. Now, the fact that we have control over everything is a facade, right? We talked about that before. But at the same time, the routine helps to kind of build in some expectations, right? We talked about prisoners of war. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. That's what prisoners of war do. They start a calendar on the wall. They start scratching things in. They start exercising at a certain time. They start trying to connect with, if they can, somebody on the other side of the wall, right? And that's a natural inclination to begin that routine, right? To begin to develop some kind of structure, right? And that's connected to expectation, right? So I mentioned my daughter and her friends. I did not tell her, you need to get with Lydia and Ashley and at 8:00 every night, because then she wouldn't want to do it, right? Because it came from me. But she informed me that this is what we have done, right? Because we naturally seek out those kinds of things. If we're not doing so well, right, and it's tough right now, we need to consciously be more conscious of routine and expectations. And the other thing that does is it keeps us busy and active.
Yes. Are some personality types more driven or dependent upon routine? Like, I find myself, I thrive in routine.
Right.
And my wife is such a spontaneous person. Right. Too much routine can be stifling to her.
Right. Right. And you're absolutely right. That's a good distinction to make, that different personality types have different levels of need in terms of routine. And, another aspect of personality that kind of influences that is extroversion, introversion when it comes to isolation, right? Because the introverts originally were like, oh, please, this is the best thing ever. I need to stay at home and never leave. Right. Great, Right. And the extroverts were kind of dying on the vine.
Yes.
Because they're not getting their needs met.
Right.
Right.
So you have to determine a healthy routine for the way you're wired in terms of your personality.
Yeah. And what you're really saying is that we are all unique, and it's not one size fits all. And that's especially to remember, important to remember in a family, right? Because if dad's an extrovert and said, we've got to get out, folks, we've got to get out, the little introvert is going to be like,
Yes.
And so, I think you've really brought up something important.
Wow. So Dr. Paulk, as we wrap things up in this episode, can you just give us some general, very general ways that we can maintain emotional and mental health as this probably continues for the next 3 to 5 months? And when I say general, I know that I'm just sort of opening the can to say, from your years of expertise and wealth of knowledge, what are some things that you think are really essential? You've already mentioned one. Yeah. You said if you get anything, slow down.
Yeah.
Are there some other things that you feel are maybe close to that essential as well?
Proactive, right? We all need to be proactive because the way that our society was structured and set up is no longer, which means that we do need to have that pioneering spirit where we say, okay, well, this is our situation, and we are, this far from this park or this far, whatever, and this is what we need to do for our family, but we have to be proactive about it. It's not going to be mailed to you, It's no one's going to say, this is what you have to do.
So take charge.
That's right.
Take responsibility. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. And say, listen, we're going to be stuck like this, and we're going to do the best we can. That's where forgiveness comes in, right? Because we're going to make mistakes. We are kind of creating a wheel, and so we're going to have to be careful and calculated decisions, I would say. Wow. Right? We need to kind of think things through more than we normally would because our options are limited.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. So Dr. Paulk, I haven't verbally ran this by you.
Okay.
I did send it to you in the context of the email of some of the questions I would be talking about. One of the things I would love to do, with your permission, is from time to time check in with you. And I would love to invite our listeners to email me questions they'd like me to ask you during our next conversation. And you can just email those questions to cgoins@a2church.org, cgoins@a2church.org. I'm not certain of the length of time, Dr. Paulk, I've got to know you. I know it's been 5 to 6 years now.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Somewhere. And I have sought Dr. Paulk's counsel, not as my therapist. She has me go to some of her other therapists when I've been there. But I've sought her counsel on a variety of challenges we've experienced in our church family. And I can say to you, her insights have always been very, very helpful to some of the situations we've helped guide others through. So we look forward to the next conversation. And I want to encourage our listeners, email those questions today, because it likely won't be that long before we'll be inviting Dr. Paulk back on, and we'd love to feature your questions.
That would be fantastic, and thank you.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Paulk, thank you so much for your time today. You have already given me so much. I've taken so many notes as I've listened, but I know you've also helped our audience. So thank you.
You're welcome, and I'm glad.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
I wanted to follow up this episode by sharing with you a brief description of my journey out of depression. In describing depression, a guy by the name of John Lockley once wrote, being depressed is bad enough in itself, but being a depressed Christian is worse. And being a depressed Christian in a church full of people who don't understand depression is like a little taste of hell. Now, some of you have experienced that. I've actually lived that. I want to share with you 5 things and then a bonus that really helped me walk out of a prolonged period of depression. Number 1, personal time with God. Psalm 27, verse 8, in that verse, David says this, "My heart has heard you say, 'Come and talk with me.' And my heart responds, 'Lord, I'm coming.'" During my prolonged struggle with depression, prayer, worship, reading God's word became essential. It literally became life for me. In fact, it's a habit that I have sustained for many, many years now, and it still gives equilibrium and stability to my life on a daily basis. 2, exercise became my primary hobby. Now, I've already shared a lot about my commitment to exercise. It became a commitment of mine in the 90s, but during that period of prolonged depression, I found that I needed to take really definitive action to get outdoors, go to the gym, exercise, sweat, get active. When you exercise, your body releases chemicals called endorphins. And these endorphins interact with the receptors in your brain that reduce your perception of pain. And endorphins also trigger a positive feeling in your body, similar, right, scientists, to morphine. So exercise became my primary hobby. I've maintained that for a number of years. 3, relationships were glue. They were so critical. Ecclesiastes 4, 9, and 10 says this, 2 people are better than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help, but someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Friends became essential in my life, beginning with my wife, my family, and a small circle of friends who refused to give up on me. 4, diet played a crucial role. I began paying close attention to the impact of food on my mood. There are some foods that will make you feel great for a minute, but they'll leave you in a state of crash and burn after the initial bliss has worn off. So I really paid attention to the role diet was playing. Number 5, spiritual warfare might be an issue. Now, I received an insight one day while working out at the gym on a treadmill. I still remember the location that my depression, notice I said my depression, was related to spiritual warfare around the launch of A2 Church. I don't believe that everyone's depression is related to spiritual warfare, but mine was. And upon receiving that insight, I shared it with a few in my inner circle of friends, and I began speaking God's word over my life as they prayed over me as well. Paul said this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have power to demolish strongholds." A stronghold had developed in my mind. He goes on, "We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ." I began a process of taking thoughts captive. Now, my journey out of depression was just that, a journey, but these 5 things were critical to me. Now, I said there would be a bonus, and this is the bonus, because not everyone, as Dr. Paulk so eloquently expressed, falls into the same category, and trauma and depression and all of these things are very, very subjective experience. Because of that, here's the bonus. Ask for help. ask for help. If you're in a state of prolonged depression, invite someone into that journey with you and reach out to a place like Birmingham Anxiety and Trauma Therapy Center. I know that there are other excellent counseling centers in our city. If you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Paulk in a future episode, not next week, email me at the letter C, as in Chris, Goins, Goins, C Goins, at a2church.org. That's it for the Real Faith Podcast. Again, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, please rate and review in whatever format you listen. This really helps us get the word out so that more and more people can join you in listening. God bless. This has been the Real Faith Podcast with Chris Goins. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.